Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are completely dismantling everything you thought you knew about how facts are actually found and how machines are made. We're going to look at the fascinating field of science and technology studies to figure out, is the world around us just passively discovered, or is it actively built?
Okay, let's dive right into this with a pretty provocative question about a famous monk. Because the answer to this, it fundamentally changes how we view reality. You see, we're all taught that Gregor Mendel performed these simple and genius experiments on peas and just discovered the laws of genetics back in the 1860s. But what if that discovery was actually a label applied by society decades after the fact?
Now, intuitively, we all tend to believe in realism, right? That's the idea that science just passively mirrors nature. That truths are just out there, waiting to be found, like hidden treasure. But we're going to neutrally explore a massive paradigm shift today called constructivism. This flips the whole script. It suggests that scientific and technical realities aren't just lying around in nature. They're actively constructed through social processes, human agreements, and even bitter controversies.
Section 1, Constructing Scientific Realities.
So what does this actually look like? Well, the absolutely crucial point here is that science is inherently social. It doesn't just hand us a direct, unmediated hotline to the truth of nature. Instead, knowledge is developed, it's transmitted, and it's maintained in social situations until it basically congeals into a taken-for-granted reality. A scientific fact doesn't just magically spring into acceptance, It requires a vast, complex network of people and institutions to actually build it. And this idea fundamentally changes how we view discovery. Just look at Mendel's timeline here. He published his famous paper in 1866. But for decades, it was read mostly for agricultural hybridization data, basically just replicating a known 3-to-1 ratio. Nobody called it a breakthrough. It wasn't until 1900, when other researchers were doing similar studies and suddenly realized they were in a race for priority, that the findings were retroactively labeled Mendel's law. Why? To assign priority to an earlier generation and settle a dispute. So Mendel's discovery wasn't a singular event in 1866. Society actually constructed it in 1900. We can actually see this active construction happening in modern labs too. Take the research into a hormone called TRF. When a new claim is made, it might start out looking like absolute nonsense. But then scientists go to work on it. They cite it, they test it, they question it, they modify it. They push that statement through stages of credibility until it slowly, gradually hardens into an undisputed, universally accepted fact. It's the scientists, not just science as some abstract concept, that are out there constructing these facts. Which brings us to a concept called heterogeneous construction. The pap smear is literally a perfect example of this. When George Papanicolaou released his initial findings in 1928, they were met with almost zero enthusiasm. Gynecologists just weren't interested. So the pap smear didn't save lives just because it was a neat scientific trick. It succeeded because medical, social, economic, and bureaucratic resources all had to be engineered together to make it work. The American Cancer Society had to heavily promote it. They had to create a gender division of labor, hiring female technicians for cheap piecework just to make mass screening economically viable. And local clinics, they had to constantly negotiate classifications because early on, the test had a false negative rate that could hit 50%. The whole thing was a massive heterogeneous construction project. Section 2, Humans, Microbes, and Networks. All right, let's bring some non-humans into the mix. This introduces us to actor network theory, or ANT for short. Now, ANT is a relational and materialist framework, and it does something pretty radical. It treats humans and non-humans symmetrically. What does that mean? It means an electron, a piece of lab equipment, or a tiny microbe has interests and forms alliances in the exact same way a politician or an engineer does. To make technoscience work, you literally have to manage all these different actors and get their interests to align. Take a look at the wild network of alliances surrounding Louis Pasteur. The guy didn't just study microbes in a vacuum. He built a massive, powerful network. He couldn't cure diseases by himself, so he allied with microbes by isolating and nurturing them in the lab, which gave him the tools to actually change the scale of nature. Then, he translated the French military's interest in having strong soldiers into a pipeline for his own research funding. He even staged these brilliant public demonstrations, basically turning everyday farms into controlled laboratories, to show he had control over these invisible organisms. Eventually, he enrolled hygienists, doctors, and government regulators right into his network. It's like a giant puzzle, and he fit all the pieces together. And here is the kicker. When a complex network like Pasteur's finally stabilizes, it becomes what we call a black box. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead hit the nail on the head when he said that civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. We totally take a vaccine or a working laptop for granted today. Why? Because that black box successfully hides all the messy social translations, the material negotiations, and all the fragile alliances that are locked inside it.
Section 3 is technology applied science. So we generally walk around assuming a linear model of innovation, right? The idea that pure basic science happens first, then it gets applied, and boom, a new technology is born. Well, back in the 1960s, a U.S. Department of Defense audit called Project Hindsight looked at the key events leading to their massive weapon systems. You know what they found? A measly 0.3% of those key events actually came from basic science. The vast majority were strictly technological events. This finding completely blew the traditional linear model of innovation out of the water. As historians of technology love to point out, science honestly owes more to the steam engine than the steam engine owes to science. Engineers have their own completely independent knowledge traditions. Technological development is driven by its own unique problems, its own math, and its own hands-on experimental practices. Innovators aren't just piggybacking off pure physics or chemistry. They are actively building solutions directly in response to things failing in the real world. So those gadgets you use every day, they weren't just magically birthed by science. They were hammered out by engineers solving their own distinct messy problems. Section 4. Does technology drive history? If technology isn't just applied science, we really have to ask if it's some unstoppable force dictating our future. Here we have two competing ideas. On the left is technological determinism. This was famously echoed by Karl Marx when he suggested the hand mill gives you the feudal lord and the steam mill gives you the industrial capitalist. It's the idea that material forces inevitably determine how society is structured. But on the right, science and technology studies researchers argue the opposite. Objects have absolutely no essential features outside of human environments. It's social groups that interpret, shape, and ultimately determine what a technology even is. This brings us to a concept known as interpretive flexibility. Basically, a technology does not have a single built-in meaning or effect. Its purpose, and whether we even consider it a success or a failure, is defined completely differently depending on which social group is looking at it. Let's ground this abstract idea with a super relatable example. The safety bicycle, the standard bike we all use today, wasn't successful simply because it was objectively better or safer. When you look at the history of the bicycle, interpretive flexibility is everywhere. Young male riders initially rejected those early safety bicycles. Why? Because they thought they lacked the macho style of those wildly dangerous high-wheelers. Meanwhile, new riders didn't even think the early safety bikes were actually stable at all. The exact same artifact meant totally different things to different groups. We see this throughout history, too. The Luddites in 19th century Britain famously smashed factory machines, but they were doing it to protest the factory masters, not the mechanical gears and levers themselves. And later on, under new political theories, those exact same machines were reinterpreted as the potential saviors of the working class. The crucial takeaway here: good design is the result of a technology's social success, not the independent cause of it. For a highly relevant modern example, just look at digital rights management, or DRM, on your digital files. The encryption technology alone absolutely cannot stop copying. No way. For DRM to actually work as a barrier, it requires this massive chaperone network. We're talking institutional negotiations between tech manufacturers, the social legitimation required to get consumers to actually agree to it, and the heavy legal wrangling by governments to criminalize bypassing it. The technology is completely, utterly intertwined with the social structure. And this brilliantly illustrates why technological determinism falls so short. If we trace the history of the electric vehicle, we uncover an incredible fact. In 1900, electric taxis were a massive success. The electric vehicle company was literally the largest automaker in the US. They totally thrived in delivery niches because they were quiet and way easier to restart than early gas cars. But the gasoline car didn't eventually win out because of some superior chemical bond in petroleum. It won because of historical social contingencies, things like Henry Ford's assembly line economics, the rugged demands of World War I, and the massive post-war expansion of the suburbs, which entirely reshaped society around the longer range of the internal combustion engine. Society chose the winner, not nature.
Section 5. The future is built.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really need to look at how all these pieces fit together. The world you live in is a co-production. It's what we call a socio-technological ensemble. Society and technology are so deeply interwoven that it's frankly impossible to separate them. Purely social relations, those exist only among baboons. And purely technical relations, those exist only in science fiction. Together, we build these durable technological frames, like our massive global system of cars, steel, and petroleum, that then turn around and guide our future actions and infrastructure.
History could be almost nothing without technology, but equally, technology could be almost nothing without history. Recognizing that our reality is a heterogeneous construction, built out of labs, social networks, military funding, consumer interpretations, and raw materials, doesn't weaken science or technology at all. Actually, it empowers us. It shows us that if the world was built this way due to historical contingencies, well, it could always be built differently.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought to really ponder. If science and technology are social constructions rather than just inevitable, unstoppable forces of nature, what future will you choose to build? I really hope this explainer has sparked your curiosity and given you a completely new lens to look at the machines, the facts, and those taken for granted black boxes all around you. Thanks for hanging out and joining me on this deep dive into the construction of reality.